The field of psychology is often assumed to have been developed in the modern era. Very little is known about the contributions made by Muslim psychologists centuries ago. Recently, at the Canadian Muslim Mental Health Conference, we sat down with Dr. Rania Awaad to explore the history of Islamic psychology. Dr. Awaad is a researcher and the director of the Muslims and Mental Health Lab at the Stanford University School of Medicine. In addition to her medical training, Dr. Awaad holds certifications in various traditional Islamic disciplines and serves as a professor of Islamic law at Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California. Dr. Rania Awaad, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Thank you for having me.
So you've done a lot of research into the history of mental health in the Muslim world.
Right.
We often assume that the idea of mental health and all of those studies started maybe in the 19th century, but your research tells us that there's a much deeper history. Can you tell us about that?
Definitely. I think it's very important actually that not just the Muslim community, but also the broader medical and psychological community understands that as well, that there's such a rich heritage and history that Muslims have in relation to mental health. And the reason it's so important to say that is because we find that in our communities, and this is true of many marginalized communities as well, that there's such a high stigma in that community from seeking mental health treatment or feeling like they won't get help even if they did, or won't be understood even if they got help. However, as it relates to Muslims, I think what's really important to talk about is that rich heritage they actually have in relation to mental health and all the advances that were made. So really we should start from the Islamic Golden Age, which roughly is about the 6th to 13th centuries of Islam. And in that era, as most Muslims and the way I grew up too, understanding and learning, we really pride ourselves on that Golden Age. We talk about the advancements of medicine, the advancements of science, of humanities. But rarely have we ever talked about kind of the mental health advancements that happened there as well, in what today would be the fields of psychology and psychiatry. So my team and I at Stanford, the Stanford Muslims and Mental Health Lab, we looked at 125 medical manuscripts from that golden era and focused primarily on mental health. And it was easy to do that, so not necessarily easy in terms of language. It was all in classical Arabic and sometimes very difficult language because it's old language to understand. But easy in the fact that when the scholars of the past would write about health, they would start from the top and go to the head and go to the toes. So we just concentrated right here.
Okay.
And as we looked at all those manuscripts, it became very clear. I was just trying to find what I thought would be like pre-modern understandings of mental illness, but came to find that there was very sophisticated understandings. And really you see that Islam coming in was the impetus that propelled these scholars to really seek out this knowledge. You know, the sayings of the Prophet and the sayings of Islam that say, you know, if God put down an ailment on earth, he's also going to give it its cure or knowledge of that cure. And this really was that impetus for the scholars to get out there and to really see how to solve these problems. Also, what was really interesting was how incredibly sophisticated and modern their understanding of illnesses was. And one of the most phenomenal scholars that I came across in this reading of all these manuscripts was somebody by the name of Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. Currently his text is actually translated, so people can find it, translated as The Sustenance of the Body and Soul. At the time we did their research, it was still all in Arabic at the time.
What time period was he from?
And he is from the 9th century.
Okay.
Yeah. And what was really amazing about him is he wrote in his chapters, little manuscript, but it was very packed, mashallah, what's in there. And chapter after chapter, he writes about all these different illnesses. And when I came across one that felt to me as a psychiatrist probably was what today we would call obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, I was really astounded because I had understood from my medical training that OCD was considered to be a modern illness, only really described and understood in the 19th century. And the beginning, and even if you look at it historically, the earliest description in any medical textbook about a case study on OCD starts in at best the 17th century, right? So this is the 19th century, and al-Balkhi is in the 9th century.
Wow.
So I went to my mentor, and I went to my mentor and I said, I found something I think is really interesting, and I described what I found. And he was really surprised, even though he was one of the forefathers of OCD in the country, and Stanford has one of the most prominent OCD centers in the country, in America. And so he asked us to translate it, so we did. And then what was really interesting is actually not just the discussion on OCD, but the fact that Abu Zayd al-Balkhi was able to classify it correctly, in which which category of illnesses it falls under, and then be able to actually symptomology figure out how to diagnose it, and then talks about its treatment.
Wow. What does he call OCD?
He uses the word that we would typically use in religious terminology of waswasa.
Okay.
So he calls it wasawis al-sadr, right? These whisperings of the self. But it doesn't stop there, kind of like, oh, this is just sort of like outside influence or internal kind of spiritual whisperings, but rather understands that there's a biological cause to this. And you see that when he discusses treatments. So what was really interesting is I started to realize that all the symptoms that he had put as his criteria, Balkhi's criteria for OCD, matched what the current DSM, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatry, that we diagnose, any clinician would have to diagnose based on those criteria to say that a patient has such and such illness. So I put them side by side. And the most current version of the DSM, which is the DSM-5, was published in 2013, put that criteria side by side with Al-Balkhi's criteria, and he meets every criteria point by point. So when Muslims say this field of psychiatry is not for me, it's a Western construct that doesn't actually work for the Muslim, I actually have now proof, and all of us have proof to sort of say, not only can it work if implemented properly, but it's also part of our rich heritage and legacy.
You mentioned that in terms of describing the illnesses and things like that, and Al-Balkhi was quite accurate. What about in terms of the treatment? Does the treatment that was available in those days, does it match up to modern treatment?
So in that second paper on phobias, phobias and disorders like obsessive compulsive disorder are treated with a type of therapy that's called exposure therapy. So it's a little bit, it seems a little bit strange to take somebody who has a fear of something and to expose them to that very fear. But it turns out that's actually how the therapy works. And it desensitizes or minimizes eventually their fear or anxiety response to that thing that they're worried about or fearing. Al-Balkhi describes this exactly and accurately, to the point that the reviewers that I was referring to in the medical journals, when they wrote back to us, they said that they were just amazed that he had the same concepts that today we would call cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which a form of that is exposure therapy, and how he might have actually have been one of the very first CBT therapists in the world, right? Until we can find someone earlier than him. But again, CBT is considered to be a very modern understanding that was only developed in the last several decades.
So what do you think the average person, the average Muslim or person who's interested in knowing about Islam can really take away from this kind of research?
I think what's important to realize is that a couple of really key things, that what's so special about Islam that the scholars have really propelled themselves and come to understandings that today we find to be the same conclusions we reach today after all that science and technology has been able to give to us, that they were able to reach these in essentially pre-modern times. What is it about Islam that gave that impetus? And so we think back to the verses in the Quran that talk about those who have mental turbulence and specifically request that we are kind to them and that we feed them properly and that we take care of them, right? This is a Quranic injunction, right? And then all the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, where their discussion is on, that seek knowledge, right, from the beginning of your life to the end of your life, and seek knowledge even if it means going far. And all of these injunctions of really understanding the world around you, including the human being inside of you, right? So I think that's something really special, first of all, to really understand that there's something special about Islam's ability and congruence with science, not its division with science, as often as the modern discourse, that religion and science are at opposition or in opposition to each other. That's not necessarily the case with our faith, and we see that proven over and over again.
Why do you think that there was a break in the transmission from people like Al-Balkhi to modern times?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think most recently I've been really looking into this topic more than before. After the golden age of Islam, you find what we call the decline period. And in that decline period, it's unfortunate, but there is, as most societies, they have a peak and then they sort of decline. We know that was a time of a lot of infighting. We also know that's a time of eventually a lot of colonialism as well. So then you start getting these ideas that are superimposed onto the Muslim community that is not from its original state, right? And those are kind of brought up, a lot of these isms that are then brought up as better conditions, but that's problematic because then those are in opposition sometimes with Islamic ideas and values to potentially. So what happens is with this decline period, you find things that you find in today's modern Muslim communities. Like when you ask people, why do people have mental illness? And they immediately will say, jinn, right? Kind of this idea that there is a possession that's happening, or ayn, the evil eye, right? Or they may say sihr, magic, right? They may have these, and these constructs are actually part of Islam, like we do accept them as, but we can't say that they are the only reasons for people's mental illnesses, right? And so that's important because when in that decline period, you see moving away from all the advancements the scholars and our noble predecessors had come to, and moving into this discussion of jinn, ayn, sihr, right? Evil eye, magic.
So they're a more of spiritual type of explanation for mental illness rather than doing more of the hard work of diagnosing and treating.
The biological understanding that it could be spiritual and biological together, right? Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. Where do you think people can go to learn more about this type of research that you've done?
So I would definitely welcome them to visit our Muslims and Mental Health Research Lab webpage at Stanford.
Okay.
There's kind of listing out of the different projects that we have going. There's 9 different lines of research that run through that lab. The historical line is only one of the many that are there. So that's one place. The other place that's very useful is looking at the Khalil Center. The Khalil Center is a Muslim counseling center that integrates what it kind of is, its a goal is to integrate concepts of Islamic spirituality into the therapy process. So there are branches of the Khalil Center in Chicago and also in California. And hopefully that will be expanding as well over time. But this idea of making sure that the primary sources and the framework for Muslims, that is absolutely incorporated into the therapy process.
Okay, thank you very much.